Just a little bit of review here, right? We always start our study of Scripture with what? Prayer. And then we've been working on this first leg of the journey, which is all about understanding the main point of the author, right? And we did that by thinking about the genre of the book, or thinking about keeping context in mind. We talked about staying on the line, asking good questions, and then seeing the structure of a passage, right? And as we do those things, that helps us see the main point of a passage. And now we're ready to then move towards understanding how this connects us to Christ. So that's what we're going to talk about right now. But like before we do, I just want to come back to this idea of context a bit, right? And even just thinking about how, again, Genesis is written in contrast to the stories that were around. So, for example, the whole idea of human beings being made in the image of God is an idea that was present somewhat in other cultures, except it was only ever the king that was in the image of God. And so think about how different that is in the biblical worldview, where every human being is made in the image of God, right? So it's that's something that we don't need to know that background to understand how special it is that every human being is made, how special it is that every human being is made in the image of God. But knowing that background does help us see, wow, this really was very different from what was going on in the culture, right? This is a very different worldview back then, but I would say too, right, it's still a different worldview today, where so often today, people are valued not just because they're human, but because of what they can do or bring to the table, right? So just thought I'd hit that real quick. But all right, so let's talk about this idea of Christ connection. The idea is that the whole Bible is one story told by one capital A author, God, with one main hero, and that's Jesus. That's what Jesus taught his disciples. So if you look at Luke 24, he tells the disciples, it says that he opened their minds to understand what was written about him in the Scriptures, right? Or in John 5, when he's debating with the Pharisees, he says, if you would have searched the Scriptures, you would have seen that they point to me. Right? So in both kind of understanding the point of a passage, but also in making sure it applies to your life, Jesus says it always points to me and then gets to you. And if we miss that, we're just going to end up with maybe a good moral lesson or a good teaching, but we're going to miss some of the transformative power that comes when we understand how we receive God's word through the word incarnate Jesus and what he's done for us, right? So you're probably thinking, yep, okay, this makes sense. I'm a Christian. I want to see how it points to Jesus, but how do we do that, right? So this is where this little acronym comes in for Christ connection. All right, so the idea for C is a command. Okay? And what we're going to do here is we're going to take the main point of the passage that we've come up with, so not any random little detail in the passage. This is crucial, not some random detail, but seeing the main point of the passage and ask, is the main point of the passage a command? If it is, we want to ask, how did Jesus fulfill this command for us and now enables us by the Spirit to live it out? Okay? So for example, when the Old Testament law says, do not murder, Jesus tells us, well, really what that means is you can't even have a hateful thought against your brother or sister, which means we've all blown it, right? But the good news is that command points us to Jesus. The command points us to the fact that actually there is one who never, ever had a hateful thought towards his brother or sister, Jesus. And he died for us, who broke that law, that command. And now by his Spirit, he can enable us to go and love better than we could on our own. Do you see how that's different than, say, you read your Bible and say, okay, I'm going to try really hard today, God, to not hate my brother. That's all on you. But if you see how the command points you to Christ, you go, Jesus, thank you so much that you did what I couldn't. Now, would you help me today to depend on you and your Spirit to do what I can't do on my own? It's the same application on one hand, trying to love your brother or sister, but it's completely different power source as opposed to if you do it on your own or whether it's through Christ, right? So that's C for command. So you're asking, is the main point command? Great. Now, if the main point's not a command, it might be H for hope or promise. The idea here being, is the main point of this passage that God's made a promise or has given us some type of hope that's fulfilled in Jesus, right? So, you can think about, Isaiah 53, right, and the suffering servant and how there's this promise that one day one's going to come who's going to take upon himself our sin, right? Well, when we read that, it points us ahead to Jesus. We go, yes, he's the one that fulfills that for us, right? R is for recurring theme. And then T is for type. I'm going to kind of do these together because they're very similar, and sometimes they can feel fuzzy categories. Don't worry about which category it fits in, but the idea of a recurring theme is there a pattern of how God's at work here that's repeated and ultimately fulfilled in Jesus? A type is something similar, but where it's a person, place, event that really did happen, but also points forward to how God's going to work in Jesus. So, for example, when you read about the Passover lamb in Exodus, right? It really happened. The Israelites really did kill lambs and smear blood on the doors, and God really rescued them out of Egypt. But that becomes a pattern or a type or a theme that gets repeated, right? That, well, this is how God's going to deliver us again in the future, that when we're in slavery to sin and death and the devil, a perfect lamb will be slaughtered, and as we trust in that sacrifice, we're rescued, right? So that same pattern emerges. So that's what points us ahead to Jesus. I is for ill, as in something that's gone wrong. So the idea here is there something, does the main point of the passage show us that the world is broken, and that points us to our need for someone to come and fix it, which is Jesus. So for example, if you study the Tower of Babel, that story on its own, you would get to the end of the story and be like, well, the main point is that God judges united human rebellion. That's not a solution, that's just a problem, right? We have united human rebellion, God judges it, we're now dispersed and divided. How is this ever going to get fixed? Well, we look ahead to Jesus, who's the one that comes, right? And by his Spirit brings all the nations together back, right? S is for story. And the idea is, does the main point here of the passage help advance the story of redemption? So for example, when you're reading Ruth and you read about how finally at the end of the story, a baby is born that gives hope to Naomi and Ruth because the family line will continue, we see God's provision for them, right? But it's not just provision for them, it's advancing the story because, oh, what do you know? That son, Obed, is the father of Jesse, who's the father of David, who's the father of Jesus, right? So we see how God's not just doing something in their individual life, but he's doing something much bigger in the story of kind of redemption. We want to ask, how does this passage connect to that? Okay? Yep?
Can you develop a little bit the idea of, say, David and Goliath?
Yeah, yep.
Where, in books written, we all have our Goliaths.
Right, yep, yep. Yeah.
I'm missing the point.
Yep. Yeah, so that's a great thing. So there's a difference between, I think, making a good text-driven connection to Christ and allegory. Okay? So allegory is the idea that there's some secret knowledge, right, that if you bring that key into the text, you have all these connections. So for example, the parable of the Good Samaritan. I think it's a parable that shows this is what true love is meant to look like. But Augustine was like, oh, like the guy that comes by and picks him up is Paul, and the inn is the church, and the down payment is the merits of the saint. And he just like everything had some special meaning that made sense in Augustine's brain, but it's not in the text. You would never read the passage and be like, oh yeah, I see that, right? So, for example, with like the story of Goliath, right? Like we don't look at that story and go, how do I make a one-to-one connection to all these things to my life today. That's allegory, where the connections are somewhat arbitrary, right? What we want to do with a good Christ connection is say, what's kind of the main point of the passage? How does the text point us to Jesus? So, for example, when you read the David and Goliath story, the main point of the story is that through David, God's anointed one, he's not just anyone, he's God's anointed, God will show his glory amongst the nations by defeating Goliath, right? So if I ask, well, is that a command? No. Is that a promise? No, it's not a direct promise. Is there a recurring theme here? Does God show his glory by defeating the enemy of God's people through a special anointed one? Absolutely. And that's Jesus, what he does, right? So I'm not going to insert myself into the story. I'm going to see how the story points me to Jesus, right? So that's the difference between allegory, where I make my own connections, and a Christ connection or a type, which is where we're seeing how does the text and how God's working connect to what Jesus is doing, all right? And I do think that's a great point you raised, Doug, because I think we can confuse those things. And then we'll read into ourselves like all kinds of things that really just aren't there, right? It might make us feel good, but I don't know if that's actually the point of the text, right? Because like sometimes God lets us, like if you're going to do allegory and say, well, I can always defeat my Goliath. Well, no, actually, sometimes you don't. Sometimes your Goliath beats you if you're going down the allegory road, right? Because we can see in Scripture, like Hebrews 11, some people of God closed the mouths of lions, and some were sawn in half. And they're all faithful, right? So we don't want to import a meaning into the text. We want to let the text naturally point us to Jesus. And that's something, too, this is why it's so important to let the main point of the text drive us to Jesus. Because if we just do some random connection to Jesus, it's like you're using the text as a trampoline and you're just bouncing off the text to get to Jesus, as opposed to believing the text is like a mine and Jesus is at the bottom of the mine. We're digging into the text to get to him. All right? So let's look at Genesis chapter 2. I left the main point up on the board on purpose, right? God designed humans to live in harmony as man and woman to tend God's garden under his command. So that's what we said the main point of chapter 2 was, right? So let's just kind of use this grid and think through how would we connect it to Christ. So is this a command? And sometimes there could be multiple ways we can get to Jesus, but is this kind of a command for us to live out?
Verse 16.
Right, so the idea of living under God's command, right, that's kind of a command, right? And obviously, we don't do this perfectly, right? But did Jesus perfectly submit himself to the Father and live under his command? Yeah, right? So we can see that Jesus is the perfect human, right, who's perfectly obeying God and tending God's world, right? So that's like one way we can point to Jesus, right? Is there a hope or a promise here? No. Yeah. Is there a like recurring theme or like a type here? Is there in the harmony of man and woman, this design, does that point us to Jesus in some way? Does that ring any bells for a New Testament passage? Like Ephesians 5? What?
Marriage.
Yeah. So marriage, Paul tells us in Ephesians 5, and he quotes from this passage, was a symbol of Christ's relationship to the church, right? So marriage, the marriage relationship, which is God's design, part of it, to live out this vision, actually is fulfilled in Jesus' relationship to the church, right? So I think that does two significant things. One, it helps us understand what a real marriage is supposed to look like. But two, it also means that if we're not married, we can still live out this passage. Because God's design for humans is to live in relationship to Jesus as part of his church to take care of his world under his command. That's how we see this now in light of Jesus. Right? This isn't just a passage about marriage, but marriage is meant to be a picture for Jesus' love for the church. So now I'm reading this passage in light of that and going, yep, there's still something I learned about marriage and how marriage works here. But marriage isn't the ultimate anymore in light of Jesus. The ultimate is relationship with Jesus. And that relationship, the relationship within the church, is what God really uses to take care of the world. That's really transformative. And think about just people that we know maybe that are in singleness, or like I think of a friend who is same-sex attracted and is committed to living a life of celibacy. If he reads this passage and says, it's only if I'm married that I can live out God's good design, then he's really going to have a hard time, because he knows he doesn't want to marry a girl, but he knows God's words told him he can't marry a guy. But if all of a sudden this passage is seen through the light of Jesus, then he's invited to be part of this, because God's design is at work through Jesus and the church. And marriage was just a pointer to that. So he still works through marriages, but ultimately he works through Jesus and the church, right? So probably these ones here are kind of the two ones that kind of we use, right? Where we look at this passage and go, wow, I'm so grateful that even though we mess up this mission all the time, that Jesus didn't. And so because of that, he can now empower us to do it. And wow, I'm so grateful that Jesus invites me into a relationship with him and part of his people, so that together as a church family, we can live out this mission, right? That's going to change our application, right? If we're seeing this in light of Jesus. Not radically, but it does tweak it a bit, right? You see that? So this is why it's important, especially when we're in the Old Testament, to see how it connects to Christ. And a quick tip is, if the New Testament is quoting from your passage in the Old Testament, go there first. Don't reinvent the wheel. Let them kind of lead the way. So let's practice this together now. So break up into a couple of groups here, and I want you to read Genesis 3, all right? Pray, and then you're going to identify the structure of Genesis 3. You're going to try to write out the main point, and then you're going to try to kind of use this grid and ask, what's the best way for it to connect to Jesus, all right? And we're going to practice putting these tools together. So